Jeff, when can we start? Jeff, when can we start? Anytime. Oh, okay. I think we should start before the sun goes down.
Robbie's not ready yet.
Okay. Ravi, are we ready to roll?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, that's so. Well, I'm very glad to be able to join you, despite the little obstacles we had on the way, or at least I had on the way to get here. I want to express my gratitude to Ravi for making this all possible. So as you have been also, I've just been sitting here quietly preparing motivation and recalling the extraordinary event that took place here more than 2,500 years ago, to remind you a little bit of the immediately preceding context for the Buddha coming to this place. Having achieved awakening in Bodh Gaya, he rested in that state of awareness, of awakening for 49 days, and then was moved by compassion to share his insights with others. And he thought of the two great yogis with whom he had trained in Samadhi some 6 years earlier when he first set out on his quest, knowing that they would be very ripe, they would be able to receive what he had to offer. But he checked with his mind, and he saw that it's with his heightened awareness, and he saw that they had already passed away. So they couldn't receive teaching from him in that lifetime. But then he thought of his 5 close companions with whom he had engaged in many ascetic practices for some years, knowing they too would be very ripe for the teachings he had to offer, and he saw that they were all alive and healthy, and that they were here in Sarnath. And so, knowing that they would be the suitable vessels to receive the teachings that he had to offer, then he walked from Bodh Gaya here to Sarnath. And I invite you to try to imagine this yourself. They saw him coming from afar, these 5 comrades. They weren't really disciples of him at that time. They saw him walking from afar. And at that time they felt that he had kind of gone soft, because he had given up on the ascetic practices that they had been all performing together. He had earned their tremendous respect by the intensity of the austerities that he had practiced, but then he seemed to have given up when he accepted some food, namely some curd or some yogurt and some rice from one woman who offered it to him with great devotion. And from their perspective, he'd simply gone soft. From his perspective, he was restoring the vitality and strength of his body, without which he recognized that it would be not possible for him to pursue his quest to its culmination. So for Gautama himself, of course, that was no deviation. It was rather finding a middle way that had eluded him for the last 6 years. But when they saw him coming from afar, as far as they were concerned, here was the person who had kind of fallen away from the path. And so they spoke among themselves, the story goes, and said, when he comes, well, we will let him join us. But unlike before, we will not show him respect, because we have kept true to our austerities, to our self-mortification. And so if he wants to join us, he can, but we will be rather nonchalant, kind of just accept him, but don't show any respect. They all agreed among themselves that this would be a bit of cold shoulder they would show to him when he came. But they saw him walking closer and closer, and just one by one, individually, without their sharing any words, they were so deeply moved by the sheer splendor of his physical presence that without any further talk amongst themselves, any changing of heart, one by one they stood in reverence, because they recognized something really extraordinary had taken place during his absence from them. And so by the time he came upon them, they had all risen with deep reverence. They prepared a seat for him. He sat, they sat, and then they listened with great attentiveness, but already deeply moved by awe, by tremendous reverence, just by his sheer physical presence. So this first turning of the wheel of Dharma, the sutra, the discourse of turning the wheel of Dharma, in which the Buddha laid the foundation, the framework for all of the teachings he would give for the remainder of his life. This was the teaching he gave here in Sarnath, and I invite you to check this out on the internet. You can simply Google the name of the sutra, or simply the Turning of the Wheel of Dharma Sutta. You'll find several translations. They're all very good. But rather than spending this very precious time we have together right now simply reading something you could very easily read on your own, I thought I would rather just draw out the highlights, especially as they pertain very directly to us now, more than 2,500 years later. And so, as I try to do so often, I'd like to share with you the gist of the Buddha's teachings. I understand it in a very traditional context, so I have no new Dharma to add. I don't want to offer some New Age Dharma or some Alan Wallace Dharma. The Buddha did a perfectly good job. But to try to bring his teaching into the 21st century so that they are, on the one hand, utterly traditional, at the same time, utterly contemporary. So that's my aspiration to share with you. I'm so glad you can all be here. I see many familiar faces. Some names I remember, some not so clearly. But let's turn now to what the Buddha shared with this very small group, just 5 disciples, as they sat listening, I think with great expectation, because it was clear just by their sense of him that he seemed to have achieved what he was seeking. And now they were all ears, as we would say nowadays. They were all ears. He began his talk by addressing the theme of the middle way, which is characteristic of the Buddhist teachings altogether. But he addressed this, first of all, by speaking of his middle way as a middle way which gives rise to insight, to knowledge, to peace, to higher knowledge, to nirvana, or final liberation, and full awakening. So he spoke of his teaching and the path that he had followed, that he was sharing with others, as a middle way, and then middle way in the sense of avoiding what? Because whenever you speak of a middle way, you know this by way of avoiding extremes. So which extremes did he specifically address in this first talk that he gave? There were the extremes on the one hand of kind of an infatuation or fixation upon sensual desires, but it goes more than simply the desires of the 5 physical senses, of beautiful sights, of lovely sounds and so forth, but more broadly speaking what we nowadays would call hedonic pleasures. And that of course includes the sensual, but it also includes things like the pursuit of fame, of reputation, of acceptance, of love, affection, all of this by other people. And so it's much broader. Just generally what now in Buddhist tradition we call the 8 mundane concerns, right? So a fixation on those, with sensual desires being very central to them, pointing that this is one extreme, and the other extreme, one of self-mortification. So the kind of austerities that he had become so expert at, those were the 2 extremes. So if we consider these two extremes in the modern world, well, clearly the fixation upon the single-pointed or single-minded pursuit of sensual pleasures, of wealth, of fame, of reputation, of prestige, of status, of power, all of those would fit into that category. I don't think there's much difference nowadays between these pursuits now and 2,500 years ago. Still very similar. But if we look at the other extreme, self-mortification, he and his colleagues fasting, and this was a very common type of investigation, a type of exploration among the truth seekers of his era. Self-mortification, extreme physical trials, of tribulations, of fasting, and so forth and so on, in the pursuit of liberation, we look around nowadays, I don't think that's so common. It may not be something, as you look into your past, oh, where was my self-mortification phase? I actually went through a little bit of that as a monk, but nothing to the intensity that he did. But nowadays in our modern world, self-mortification doesn't seem to be a major extreme that many people are interested in, right? So we might think, well, we're living in the 21st century. We don't really need to be concerned with that because we're not interested. But perhaps he has some deep wisdom to share with us about avoiding the extreme of just sensual gratification, pursuit of mundane happiness. But I'd like to take a second, and I'd like to not let us off so easy, thinking we have only one extreme to avoid. Maybe we too, like the people of his time, have two extremes to avoid. So it's not self-mortification, but I was reflecting upon this. What do we do instead of self-mortification? So first of all, why did they do it? Why did they do it? Because there were many people. It wasn't just a small band of people engaging in various types of austerities. There's the real word, austerities, where they're really punishing themselves. And it was kind of a mind over matter type of endeavor, sheer grit, sheer willpower, determination, almost trying to, how do you say, siege the ramparts, or overcome the ramparts of samsara to break your way into liberation. So is there anything like that, of showing yourself as being a person of true mettle, of strength, of forbearance, you're really somebody? Is there anything of that nowadays? And the closest I could come to, for something that is very, very prevalent in the modern world, is the addiction to work. Literally working ourselves to death. Literally working ourselves to death. And I've met many people like that. I was in New York just a couple of days ago, and I was getting some photos taken for my passport, or for my visa to be able to get into this country again, since I've been here during the last 60 days. And the person who prepared the photos for me, New Yorker, really classic New Yorker. And he was very chatty, and we immediately entered into a kind of conversation as he's preparing to take my photos. And he said, I see people every morning, and every Monday on their way to work. And they all look so depressed. They all look so tired, so unhappy, because they're facing a full week of work. And they just look miserable. And then Friday, now they look happy. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, until Friday afternoon, then they look happy. What are they doing for those 5 days? I think we will call it austerities. They're working themselves, they are engaging in trials and tribulations. They may not be starving themselves, not fasting and so forth, but they are engaging a type of self-mortification, a type of austerity. And I think it's especially true in the Western Hemisphere, that instead of simply working to make a living, to live a meaningful life, people sometimes live in order to work. That their life really becomes equated with the work. And somehow there's something to prove. Their self-value, that they are successful, that they are worthy people. And this is perhaps their notion of this is how you achieve liberation, by working really, really hard and making a success of yourself. So I think, as far as I can tell, that's the closest we come to some modern version. And then there's Friday. So when we consider what is a very common lifestyle nowadays, and it's not only in New York, it's not only in Europe. I know you're from multiple countries here, in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, in Sydney, it's all over the world, where 5 or 6 days a week, people are engaging in austerities. They're going to work, they're just working hard to succeed, as somehow thinking this will be a path to liberation, but the liberation comes on Friday, when they can take a day off, 2 days off, and then it's a total fixation on sensual pleasures. It's watching football, it's watching this cricket, it's just enjoying themselves, trying to eke out some hedonic pleasure on the weekends, and then it's back to work, back to the grind. So in fact, I think these two extremes are very common nowadays as well. And the Buddhist point was these two extremes, whether of yogis living 2,500 years ago or people simply in the workforce today, we spend an enormous amount of time on these two extremes. Is there anything in between? What I'm referring to, if we look at the notes, is kind of a self-destructive work ethic. That is, what I'm proposing here is not that we all quit work or that something's wrong with work, but when it undermines our very sense of well-being, when we're simply working ourselves to death, then that has to be one extreme. And then the other one is simply, of course, just the pursuit of hedonic pleasure. So in this way, this is one of two ways at least in which the Buddha said that his own teachings, the Dharma that he was sharing with others, was going against the grain, was going against the stream of the world. It wasn't just going with the flow of what everybody else believed, but he was suggesting something that would be contrary to the way of life of many people at that time. So where did he come from? The life of a prince was pretty much 100% indulgence in sensual pleasures, and then going off and becoming an ascetic, a yogi with austerities, 6 years of exploring the other extreme and finding neither one gave rise to freedom, gave rise to satisfaction, gave rise to genuine happiness. And so knowing this from his own experience, then he found through his own experience this middle way, which then goes against the way of the world, which is all about the pursuit of hedonic pleasure, but was also going against the grain of many of the yogis, the sadhus, the rishis of the time, where it was all mind over matter, seeking to achieve liberation by the sheer power of your will, your mind over your body, and so forth, subduing, conquering your body with the power of your mind, and finding that too didn't work. So that's one way in which the Buddhist teachings were going against the grain, or going against the commonplace. But there's another way as well, and that is, it's stated in the sutras that whatever the world regards as reality, just the world, everybody around you, whatever the world regards as reality, the Aryas, those with direct insight, those with direct experience of nirvana, they regard as delusive. So what the world regards as authentic, real, true, the Arya regards as delusive. And then likewise, what the world, the mundane people, devoted to this mundane way of life, what they regard as truly happy, satisfying, the Arya regards as dukkha, as unsatisfying. So it's kind of a 180-degree turnabout from common way of viewing reality and also what is accepted as a worthy and suitable, meaningful way of life. So he's clearly going against the grain. If we take the triad of Buddhist practice of worldview and then meditation and then way of life, we can see in a way that Buddhist teachings are swimming upstream on all three accounts. They were back then because the kind of teachings the Buddha was giving was given by no one else. He was saying, you will hear what you have never heard before. I will teach what you have never been taught before. And so in terms of view, what is true, what is not true, the types of meditation that he taught, above all, his tremendous innovation that was unprecedented in India at that time was his extraordinary union of shamatha, many of you know the term, and vipassana. So shamatha developing very deep insight, samadhi, and the vipassana, the insight, and the fusion of the two. That was unprecedented. That was going against the grain. And then the way of life, again avoiding the life of luxury, but also avoiding the life of sheer austerity for the sake of austerity. So that's how he began his Dharma talk, his turning of the wheel of Dharma, by pointing out, I am revealing here a middle way that avoids these two extremes. And then he began his explanation of what is commonly translated as the Four Noble Truths. Very adept scholars of Buddhism by now, many of them, I think a growing number, recognize as standard as that has become as a translation. It's a really bad translation. The Four Noble Truths. First of all, the term satya that we translate as truth. It's not incorrect, but that's not quite what it means here. Satya, the Sanskrit term, also means simply reality. So the Buddha wasn't speaking of the truth of suffering, because the truth is a proposition, is true or false. But your suffering is not true or false. It's either real or unreal. It either exists or doesn't exist. And so it's much closer to say here satya simply means reality. There's a reality of suffering. But there is this term noble, and so we're going to call it four noble, not truths, but realities. But not, well, what is the term noble? Where does that come from? Well, from Arya. And an Arya is a person who has direct realization of ultimate reality, of nirvana. And so it's not that the truth of suffering is noble. I think you know from your own experience, a lot of the suffering you've experienced was not noble. It was just a pain. It might have been embarrassing. It might have been trivial. It might have been pointless. Some of the suffering we experience is kind of a total waste of time. So to think that somehow fits into a category of noble truth, or even noble reality, I don't think so, right? But that's not what was implied. So in short, this phrase, the Four Noble Truths, if we wanted to translate it more literally, and I think a much more revealing way, it's four realities, four Aryas. Four realities, four Aryas. What strikes the Arya, a person who has realization of nirvana? What are four features of reality that rise up as being of paramount importance? So that's what we're really discussing here. And the first is the reality of suffering, the reality of suffering, four Aryas. So I think all of you have some background in Buddhism. You know that a very meaningful classification of suffering is first of all what is called the suffering of suffering, or simply blatant suffering of body and mind. It's just what we experience as pain, discomfort, suffering, anguish, the whole spectrum of discomfort of body and mind, from the most mild malaise to the most profound anguish and physical pain. All sentient beings experience that, all sentient beings recognize that. More subtly than that is what is called the suffering of change. And here the implication is not that the sheer experience of change itself has to be one of suffering, that change is somehow unpleasant in and of itself, but rather what we bring to the reality of change, of impermanence, of all conditioned phenomena being in a state of flux. And so where the suffering comes in is because of attachment. Because we are attached to things being the way they are, and then they change, then suffering comes, right? And then third, I'm just going very briefly here, third is this, I would translate rather loosely as existential suffering, the suffering that comes because we are living in conditioned existence, but again, it's more than that. It's really this deepest, fundamental vulnerability to suffering comes because of our way of engaging with, of identifying with our own bodies and minds, the five skandhas. And because of our strong identification with these as being truly I and mine, this makes us vulnerable to all manner of suffering. So I'd like to pause with that threefold classification, which I find again enormously meaningful, and to relate them to a couple of other triads that we're all familiar with. Let's take the triad that comes in the second noble truth, the second reality of the source of suffering, the three poisons of hatred, of craving, of delusion. And I think we can line these up and see there's a meaningful correspondence. And that is whenever we experience hatred, anger, aggression, hostility, rage, that whole spectrum, whenever we experience that, there's always blatant suffering. Right? We never get so happy that we start getting angry. We never experience such a deep sense of serenity and peace and calm that we start feeling resentful or feeling rage, right? Anger, that whole spectrum, let's just call anger hatred, it always comes out of getting something we don't want or losing something we do want. It pretty much boils down to that. But it means there is a root, something underlying the mental afflictions of hatred, of anger, that saturates them in every single instance, and that is displeasure. We're unhappy about something, and then almost like a pot that boils over. We're unhappy, 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 and then it boils over, and now we're angry. Now we're pissed off, right? Resentful, hateful, and so forth and so on, but it always stems from or grows out of unhappiness, right? And that blatant unhappiness, physical suffering, mental suffering, there's a strong correlation there, right? In terms of an antidote, if we wanted to today start suffering less, let alone liberation in 5 years or 5 lifetimes or 500 lifetimes, if you just like to suffer less, today, what can we do today so that we suffer less? And then we have to go, of course, to the fourth noble truth, the fourth reality for Aryas, to the path, and something that yields very quick benefits in terms of the sheer alleviation of suffering is the first of the 3 higher trainings. Leading an ethical way of life, leading a life of non-violence, of non-harming. An ethical life, of course, includes not only avoiding injurious behavior of body, speech, and mind, but also, of course, devoting ourselves to wholesome conduct, being of service when we can. That summarizes all of Buddhist ethics. Avoiding inflicting harm unnecessarily, and helping out whenever the opportunity arises. If one slipped into that mode today, if one had not done so yesterday, slipped into that mode today, seeing the impulses that might come up to speak harshly, to deceive, to manipulate, to use one's body in an injurious way, or to harbor malevolent thoughts, injurious thoughts. If one made that a point today to avoid such kind of conduct, and with that as a baseline of ahimsa, of non-violence as your baseline, on top of that, then keeping your eyes wide open, where's an opportunity to help someone else out, to alleviate suffering, to lend a helping hand, to bring someone joy. And you had that as your MO, your modus operandi for a day. I think in that day, compared to yesterday, you'll find your suffering less. Your interactions with other people, they'll be more pleasant. Because people already sense their guard will come down a little bit as they sense how you're engaging with them. So there's a meaningful triad there, I think. If we go to the second mode of suffering, the suffering of change, what among the 3 poisons, which one is most strongly correlated with that type of suffering that comes in conjunction with, in our experience of change? It's quite clearly, it's craving. It's attachment, right? Because we're attached to things being the way they are when they're pleasant. Whether it's a marital relationship, a friendship, a situation in the workplace, your car being unscratched, your health, whatever it may be, because there is attachment to that, we're already primed, almost like you've pulled the, what's that called, the trigger mechanism on a pistol. When you pull that button, it's cocked, right? You're cocked, ready to fire. As soon as there's attachment, you've pulled the, what is that little thing called, the trigger? The hammer, thank you. You've pulled the hammer back. Then it's only, all you have to do is bump it, and it will fire, right? As soon as there's attachment, as soon as there's craving, the mental affliction of craving, the hammer is pulled back, and you're already primed to suffer. And in fact, if you're very alert to the reality you're experiencing, then you will be aware that everything you're experiencing that you're clinging to as a source of your happiness, it will change. So if you're paying attention and you're being realistic, you'll already feel anxious. If you're attached to things that are beyond your control, you'll already be anxious if you're paying attention. The only way to be filled with craving and not be anxious is to be delusional. To think that this isn't going to change. I'm going to stay as healthy now as I was yesterday, and everything is going to be just fine because it's going to stay just as it is. And so craving is clearly the key. The mental afflictions are most directly correlated with that second dimension of suffering. And now it becomes obvious when we attend to the third dimension of just the sheer vulnerability. Why is it so easy for us to suffer, right? And it stems from basic delusion of a misapprehension of reality. Not getting it right, that's ignorance, avidya, and then actively getting it wrong, and that's moha, or delusion. So how can we escape? How can we possibly free ourselves? It's an astounding question even to raise the question, let alone to come up with a real answer. But the question that the Gautama was raising, the incentive for him to leave a very comfortable life, it didn't get much better. in India 2,600 years ago than the situation young Gautama found himself in. He was a Trump, he was a Rockefeller, you know, he was in the Gates family, you know, he was where you want to be. And so he already had the best. And so why would he give up the best to go live with the poorest? And it clearly wasn't because of blatant suffering. He had so little. One step away from where he was probably a step into more blatant suffering, because he had it made. He wasn't going simply to escape from the second type of suffering. You can escape that at least temporarily by taking some higher rebirth in the form or formless realms. But clearly his incentive, his motivation, was to find complete and irreversible freedom. In other words, freedom from this deepest dimension of suffering. And he recognized that this could only be gleaned through insight, not through self-mortification, not simply through samadhi, and certainly not simply through following a life focused on one's own sensual gratification. So in that regard, coming back to the three higher trainings, it's wisdom. Wisdom is the only antidote, wisdom is the only remedy for gaining freedom from that deepest dimension of suffering. So, a lot of us have heard from me, from other teachers, about the distinction between genuine happiness, happiness that arises from what we bring to the world, in contrast to hedonic pleasure, the happiness, the pleasure that we get from the world. Both have their place, right? But I think it's a very meaningful distinction, that hedonic pleasure is always stimulus-driven. It's something that happens to us that arouses a sense of pleasure, satisfaction, joy, and so forth, whereas genuine happiness is not coming from something happening to us, but something that we bring to reality, right? It's a critical difference, a very clear-cut distinction between the two. And so I've been familiar with this for some time now, teaching, and I find it very meaningful, but only recently, over the last week or so, as I was reflecting, because I wanted to offer my best today, reflecting on this reality of suffering, it occurred to me that a similar distinction can be made between genuine suffering and hedonic suffering. I've not heard of that one before. But consider for yourself whether this is meaningful to you. Let's consider hedonic suffering. This could be physical, could be mental, right? And it's a suffering, it's a pain, the discomfort that arises because something happens to us, something unpleasant, right? And so it can be somebody insulting us, somebody being rude, it can come from physical injury, it can come from the weather, it can come from all kinds of things, but something happens to us and it catalyzes, it triggers an unpleasant response. And then, in the mundane way of dealing with things, we feel this discomfort, this displeasure, unhappiness, pain, and then we look around, what caused it? Who did it? What did it? Where did it? How did it? But we're looking for that catalyst, and then we find the person, we find the situation, we find the place, we find whatever it is, and say, aha, that's what I need to avoid. Or I have to fix this person. I have to fix this situation, because I know it may be unhappy, and the finger goes out. You know? Finger goes out. And now we have to repair the world. Or we have to perfect samsara. So you probably remember Shantadeva's great analogy. When you're suffering, there are two ways of approaching it. One is to cover the entire planet with leather, right? To cover all the thorns. And the other one is to put on a pair of shoes. So the person who's still trying to fix the world until everything around us is just right means we're trying to get in a situation and then hold on to a situation where nothing around us makes us unhappy. Pleasant people, pleasant job, pleasant car, pleasant body, pleasant weather, everything pleasant. And we say, ah, that's the way I want it. And then we are avoiding hedonic displeasure, hedonic suffering. But I got to thinking about something in this regard that really, I must say, it perked my interest. And that is the fact that we can sit in a room, well fed, we had a nice lunch today, and in good health, not too cold, not too hot, with no stimulation, just a bare, naked room, and a comfortable seat to sit on, right? So there's nothing happening to you whatsoever from outside that's unpleasant. You can do that, right? It's not that hard. And then with no help whatsoever, you can be miserable, right? That is, we don't really need help. We can sit by ourselves in a room. We can go for a walk. We can be drinking a glass of water and be miserable with nothing helping us from outside at all. Now that I find interesting. That I find interesting. This is why solitary confinement in penitentiaries is considered a form of punishment. I mean, if they're torturing people, then we understand. They're miserable because they're being harmed. But just put a person in an 8x10 cell, give them just enough of boring food so they're not hungry, and now the punishment begins. But not from outside. That's self-generated. That is genuine unhappiness. It's not coming from stimulus. It's not stimulus-driven. Now that, to my mind, is much more interesting than somebody insulting me and then I feel bad. Or somebody reading one of my books and said, that was a terrible book, and I feel bad. Oh, it's not so interesting. We all understand that. That suffering goes away by people say, stop saying unhappy things or unkind things. Oh, then I'm happy. Or say something nice. Oh, now I feel good. That's kind of boring. But this genuine unhappiness, that's interesting. And how it can be that a person in a penitentiary, for example, who probably got there because of his own mental afflictions and the actions coming out of them, can be put into solitary confinement and be abjectly miserable with no help from outside, whereas if you go to one of the meditation huts in the mountains above Dharamsala, or to other retreat centers, if you look at the cell of the yogis, they may just be about indistinguishable from the cell in the penitentiary, often worse. And the food's often worse. But there they are experiencing, and if they're accomplished yogis, experiencing bliss with no outside help. So this is the situation for solitary confinement, and it's the situation in a retreat center, that you're going to a place, even in Phuket, a number of you I know have been there. The rooms, once you're inside the room, is nice, but it's not that nice. You just get the temperature, so it's comfortable, but it doesn't bliss you out, right? You've already eaten your food, so no more of that. So there you are in your room. Basically, you're there for 22 hours a day, barring walks, a bit of exercise. And now you have your mind without mediation, without any buffer zone, right? So what for one person can be misery is for another person blissful. It's genuine misery and genuine bliss, right? Because it's coming from within. It comes from what you bring to that solitude rather than what you're getting from the world. And the implications, I think, are enormous. Because we'll all be facing, whether we ever spend a day in retreat from now on, whether we ever spend any time in solitude from now on. One could avoid it, I imagine. Just always make sure you're hanging out with someone. But we can be absolutely certain that we'll have at least one more time of real solitude, and solitude also in which we're being less and less exposed to any type of sensory input or stimulation from outside. It's called dying, right? It's called dying. And I've just been reading recently a book called, what was it called? It's by it's the autobiography of Arjit Rinpoche, Surviving the Dragon. I think that's what it's called. I highly recommend it. It's a remarkable book by a Tibetan Lama who was born in the same year that I was, the Tiger Year, 1950, but spent the first several decades of his life under Chinese communist rule. And he made this observation. I'm not going to elaborate here, but of course he knew a wide variety of people, and he found that those, even in these very, very difficult times, under the Chinese occupation, the Cultural Revolution, which brought so much misery to so many people, that the people that he knew who had devoted their lives to Dharma, when it came time for them to die, they died with serenity, with peace, with good cheer. And then he knew others who, if they practiced any Dharma at all, it was more phony. It was just for outer stuff, making money and so forth. And they died afraid and bewildered. So that's our final exam. But it's our final time of solitude, and it is a time that will be either one of genuine unhappiness or genuine happiness, because there's nothing coming from outside, it's all coming from inside. So there we are for the reality of suffering for Aryas. We move on to the reality, the second noble truth, the reality of the origin of suffering for Aryas. In the Buddha's turning of the wheel of Dharma, in his discourse given here, what he highlighted, because this was a very short discourse, you can read it in just a few minutes, what he highlighted as the primary cause of the suffering to which we are vulnerable, what he highlighted was craving. Craving. Looking at objects of the mind and clinging to them as being veritable sources of happiness. Clinging to them, that is, if we already have them, clinging to them with attachment. If we don't have them already, then aspiring for them with craving. Either case, seeing them as true sources of happiness. And in fact, although the craving may give rise to some hedonic pleasure, it always comes at a cost, that sooner or later it's going to give rise to suffering. So he spoke of craving, different types of craving, craving for hedonic pleasures, sensual pleasures and so forth. He spoke of craving for existence, which implies the fear of death. But he also spoke of craving for non-existence, where one craves for termination. I suspect it's probably just true. Maybe it's I would say just a tautology to say that anyone who commits suicide is doing so out of an aspiration for non-existence, at least the termination of this existence. But the Buddha pointed to all of these, the craving for hedonic pleasure, the craving for existence, the craving for non-existence, all of these as just being sources for the perpetuation of suffering. So there, it would be good to pause just for a moment. I know this is very basic, but it's always good to come back to, that there is a very important distinction between the mental affliction, the klesha, of craving for what we don't have, attachment when we do get it, craving as opposed to desire. And sometimes I think the word desire is used here, but it can be very misleading. The notion that the root of all suffering is desire. Well, how about the Buddha's, or Gautama's desire to achieve liberation, right? Or there is an ideal in Buddhism of seeking nirvana with all the passion, with all the single-pointed focus, as if your hair were on fire, right? That would imply a pretty intense desire, right? So desire is not the problem. The desire, when you see somebody else in suffering, the desire, the yearning, the wish, it may be a very powerful wish, like a mother for her own child, to alleviate the suffering of others. To say, oh, this must be a root of suffering because it's a desire, of course, it makes no sense at all. And so the desire may be wholesome, it may be unwholesome, it may be neutral, but the mental affliction, the klesha of craving, is always rooted in delusion, by definition. If it's not rooted in delusion, it's not the mental affliction of craving, right? So there's something fundamentally non-reality based in the mental affliction of craving, right? The very term klesha is related to the klishta, the term klishta, which means to distort. So whenever craving as a mental affliction arises, it always stems from a distorted, a warped, an unbalanced, or unrealistic way of viewing reality. Desire may be utterly reality-based, right? But craving by definition is not. So there I think we can, all of us, we're all old enough to review our own experience and see there's an enormous amount of truth in that, right? So pragmatically speaking, we can speak of craving as being right on the cutting edge of serving as the cause, the origin of suffering. But then if we dig deeper, and that is, why do we crave? It's always good to keep on asking why. Why is that the case? And the craving always stems from delusion, a delusion of misapprehending reality, right? So it can be craving to hold on to something that's agreeable, that's desirable, but it can also be craving to be free of something that we don't want, and then it can easily manifest as aggression, as anger. But either way, this craving, or all of the mental afflictions, stem from a reified sense of self, a self as autonomous, as separate, as independent, as radically other from every other sentient being, and underlying that an even deeper rift, something more fundamental even than I versus you, something more deeper than that, and that is just the distinction of I, the subject, as object over there, whether sentient or unsentient, subject and object, in the sense that subject and object are radically and fundamentally separate, right? That what I'm seeing in terms of all objects, all appearances to the mind, that they're really radically out there. Whereas I, my mind, I myself, radically in here, and there being a strong division. This crops up whenever we feel craving, isn't it true? again, none of this is dogma, none of this is really religion. Everything I'm saying, I think, lends itself to direct experiential investigation. But consider in your own experience, whenever you experience craving or attachment, don't you have a sense that that which you're craving, holding on to, hoping will deliver happiness, or clinging to it as if it really does deliver happiness, is something other than yourself, something you have to hold on to? And likewise, whenever we get really angry, isn't there a sense of being angry at something that's radically other than oneself? Ironically, we know these terms: self-hatred, self-contempt, self-loathing, low self-esteem. We're all familiar with these terms. You don't find them in Sanskrit or Tibetan, but we have them in all of the Western languages. Very common terms, right? Even there, if I say, oh, I just can't stand myself, I hate myself, isn't there even there a sense of separation between the self who is loathed and the loathing self, as being somehow separate, that I who hate myself, well, at least I'm not as bad as the I that I hate. Because if I were that bad, well, I would really be in sad shape. But at least I'm smart enough to know that I'm really a stinker, that I'm really an awful person. Don't you agree? So, okay, we're a little bit better than that guy. You know, me, him, right? So even there, I think there's something of a separation. Likewise with self-infatuation, narcissism, looking into the mirror, looking at whatever, and saying, oh, I'm so special. Even there, the I becomes an object. That something separate, something to be proud of. I'm so proud of myself. Already there's something of the division there. It's strange. So, the long and the short of it, we can say, pragmatically speaking, what directly delivers up the suffering that we experience is craving. Craving, grasping, attachment. But underlying that is the delusion that allows for that craving to arise in the first place. And so, relating these to the fourth noble truth, that which directly overcomes the craving is samadhi. The craving for all these objects. When you achieve shamatha, you achieve deep samadhi, then you're tapping into something that actually is a wellspring of happiness. Now you can be attached to that too. But then to cut through that which underlies craving and attachment, to cut through the delusion, then samadhi isn't enough. If it were enough, then Gautama could have had a very short excursion away from the palace. Because the first thing he did, of course, was seek out first one and then two great samadhi masters, achieving the same level of extraordinary samadhi that they had. And if that were it, if that were enough not only to cut through craving, to really attenuate craving almost down to zero, if that were enough to also eradicate delusion, then he would have just gone off and been, you know, a happy camper, and would not have had to engage in those 6 years of austerity. So the only remedy, again, for delusion that underlies craving, we keep on coming back to the central theme, that it is wisdom, it's insight. One final point there, you'll see in the notes, is that we have all kinds of ignorance and all kinds of delusion, and much of it is acquired. We have to learn it. The notion that people of a different skin color, maybe lighter, maybe darker, maybe browner, maybe pinker, you know, or even hair color, who knows what, people with bigger noses or smaller noses. But racism, fundamentally, has to be learned. Babies aren't racist, right? And so there are many such delusions, such as racism, that we're not born with. We have to learn them. Religious bigotry, dogmatism, intolerance of a wide variety. We have to learn these. Now, once we've learned them, we've absorbed them, they can certainly be sources of major suffering. We know how many occasions and throughout history where so much suffering, just inconceivable suffering has come because of learned ignorance regarding one's own race as superior, one's religion as superior, and so forth and so on. But when we attend to the reality of the source of suffering, a very important point is that that which truly lies there in the bedrock, the taproot, the deepest dimension of the source, is not something learned. Learned ignorance is very important to dispel, but the level of ignorance and delusion that is truly the root cause of suffering is something that is inborn. So even babies, cute little babies, they have it. Animals have it. All sentient beings have it. That's why we don't escape from it just by stopping being human. And a final point on that note is that, and actually it pertains to the first reality of suffering, it's so important. It changes everything. And I'm just going to take just a one step back to the reality of suffering before we go to the cessation. It's such a commonplace nowadays, especially in a materialistic world, a world of modernity, which is not entirely materialistic, but it certainly is a loud voice. And we hear it on the media all the time. We have but one life. Well, you only have one life. You know, this is it. This is your one shot. You know, and then you're just dead. You know? And so there's something implied there, which is for, I find this actually is a bit comic. To my mind, it's a bit comic. For people who are not believers, then of course you just accept the reality that death means total termination, lights out, you cease to exist, there's no more consciousness at all. Whereas for believers, well, believers believe in Krishna, they believe in heaven, they believe in hell, limbo, nirvana, rebirth, and so forth and so on. I find that simply comic. I really do. Because for one to know that death means the termination of your consciousness, then clearly you must know what are the causes, the necessary and sufficient causes for consciousness. You must know that, right? Because otherwise you won't know whether the necessary causes and conditions for consciousness are finished. If you don't even know what they are, then you don't know when they stop, right? But the uncontested fact, I mean, it really can't even be debated. A lot of things can be debated. A lot of what I've said already can be debated. Here's a point that I don't think can be debated, and that is the modern scientific community, which I tremendously respect, and which has gained so much knowledge. The scientific community now in 2011 does not know what the necessary causes and conditions, the necessary and sufficient causes for consciousness are. Does not know. None of them even claim that they know. They don't know how to measure it, they don't know when it arises, and they don't know what's necessary for consciousness to arise. Not in a human fetus, not in an animal, not in an insect, not anywhere. They don't know. They would like to know, and there's some very good neuroscientists trying to find out, but now, on February 8th, they don't. So if you don't know what are the necessary and sufficient causes for the emergence of consciousness, then you don't know when it terminates. It's just straight logic. And so people who believe that they are going to achieve the third noble truth just by dying, that is the final, irreversible, and complete cessation of suffering, those are the real believers. Because there is no factual basis for that. All we know is that the body stops moving and it starts to deteriorate, to decompose. Well, that's not exactly breaking news, right? And so we are all, I think the gist of what I'm saying here is that unless we are knowers, unless we actually know what happens to consciousness at death, and I believe there are people who do know, but unless we know, we're all believers, or we're simply agnostic. But the notion that if you're secular, you're somehow not a believer, whereas all religious people are believers, is, I think, quite quaint. We move on to the third reality of cessation of suffering for Aryas. As I mentioned before, pragmatically, this would mean overcoming, really banishing, that whole impulse, and even the seeds for the impulse of craving. That no matter what one encountered, whether it's a person, a place, reputation, whatever it may be, tangible or intangible, that the craving simply won't happen. There is one sutta the Buddha was saying, and the practitioner will observe, does this impulse of craving ever arise in me at all, on any occasion? If it does, then you're not free yet, right? Whereas you see, no matter what happens, if craving never arises, okay, there's an indicator. So pragmatically speaking, it's overcoming all craving. Epistemically speaking, or in terms of knowledge, it's when delusion no longer arises because it's been replaced by insight, by knowing reality as it is. And so there's a cessation there. But what does it really mean? That is, if one is going to follow this path, obviously one is not going to have a clear idea from the very beginning what it's going to be like at the very end. Right? That would take all the fun out in a way. Because then you would already be at the end if you knew what it was like already, right? So that's kind of a commonplace. So there has to be something of a mystery there because we haven't realized it yet. At the same time, oh, that would be helpful, thank you. At the same time, if we were to devote our path, devote our lives, even multiple lives, I'll just leave it there. Good. If this is going to define a life, a dedication of this path, in other words, really entrusting oneself to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, there must be some, to my mind, I know it's true for me, there must be some meaningful sense of what is the culmination of the path. I mean, if we're going in that direction, the direction I'm sure is good. If it's ethics, it's samadhi, it's wisdom, I'm sold. I'm totally, I bought in, right? But what's the culmination? Without going just yet to the culmination of Buddhahood itself, how about the ideal of becoming an arhat? Many of the Buddha's disciples did achieve that. What does that mean? And it's very clear from the Buddhist teachings in the Pali Canon that it means a cessation of conditioned consciousness. That is, your 5 skandhas, your body, your feelings, recognition of the whole array of mental factors, compositional factors, and then consciousness including all 6 forms of consciousness, the 5 sensory, and then mental consciousness. All of these arising in the Buddhist understanding in dependence upon klesha and karma, all of them being conditioned. That continuum of the 5 skandhas, that continuum of body, mind, lifetime after lifetime, that is irreversibly terminated, right? I mean, it's really clear. So, once again, one doesn't need to believe it, but within Buddhism, that really is clearly what the Buddha was stating in no uncertain terms, that the continuum of the 5 skandhas is cut. Now, one can say, well, if it's cut, that means you mean, in other words, you're not conscious anymore. You finally got to commit suicide. Ultimate, irreversible, total suicide. What the materialists think just comes easy, just by dying. The arhat has to work lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, finally gets to commit suicide, and never come back. Total termination. I'd have to say for myself, and this is true for me for the last 40 years that I've been a Buddhist, the notion that the culmination of the path is just to have everything stop doesn't make any sense. It makes the whole universe not only look like an ocean of suffering, but look like a big, nasty joke. Big, pointless joke, and the only reason to exist is to stop existing. I've never found that to be a worthy aspiration. Not something I can ever devote a lifetime to. Is, boy, I hope I can totally cease to exist. But the Buddha specifically refuted that. I mean, if that's what it was all about, then craving for non-existence would be something to be approved of, rather than the first thing he pointed out, this is to be avoided. So that can't be it. So conditioned consciousness comes to an end. Even the subtle continuum of consciousness that is conditioned, it goes on from lifetime to lifetime, that comes to an end. But what happens to the arhat after the arhat passes away? Not annihilation, and yet not more of the same. Something inconceivable, but something that can be realized. And we'll return to that topic in Bodh Gaya. Yeah, so you can't bail out just yet. See you in Bodh Gaya.
Commercial.
Because, commercial break. Because I was asked by dear Ravi to speak on the meaning of enlightenment. Well, that would be prime time to speak about the meaning of enlightenment. But for now, I think the Buddha was very deliberate in not expounding in detail about this is what it will be like. Believe me, just believe me, that if you try hard enough, you're ethical enough, your samadhi's good enough, your wisdom's good enough, this is what it will be like. He didn't go there. But it was rather recognize here's the reality of suffering. That you can know about already. You don't have to wait. And then through your own investigation, recognize through your own inquiry what is the true source of suffering, the reality of the source of suffering. He said, here's the reality of suffering, recognize it. Here's the reality of the source of suffering, eliminate it. And that's something we can do. We don't have to wait for lifetimes, for years, even for months. We can see that in one day, on occasion, if we can release craving, release anger, release delusion, there's less suffering right there. we can see it through our own experience. And so he approached the reality of the cessation of suffering as a process of elimination, that you know what the reality of suffering is, you know what the reality of the origin of suffering is, and you will be free. Now what would that be like? Well, okay, come and see. Come and see. But it is a freedom from what you do know about, and you do already want to be free of it. We don't need to be persuaded to want to be free of suffering, and any intelligent person doesn't need to be persuaded to want to be free of the causes of suffering. But much easier to talk about it than to identify it, really, in contrast to all the catalysts of suffering. Oh, I'll be this happens, if that happens, I go from here to there, get a new job, and so forth and so on. And so we then move to the path, the reality of the path to cessation for Aryas. So what the Buddha addressed in this first discourse given here, where we see so many people praying and giving Dharma teachings and just taking in the environment, is he immediately addressed the Noble Eightfold Path. So this summarizes everything that he has to teach. And so just to run through it in the order that he gave, which is interesting. This Noble Eightfold Path is often called right this, right that. I would suggest authentic might be a bit closer. So an authentic view, not the right view. When you say the right view, that sounds to me like a catechism. Like, okay, I already know it now. If you agree with me, you're right. If you agree with the textbook, you're right. But there are authentic views, and there are inauthentic views. Something in accordance with realities, something not in accordance with realities. I wasn't really interested in people who agree with reality, and if you do, that's an authentic way of viewing reality. Right? So this, once again, we all know that we've had inauthentic views, ways of perceiving and understanding one situation or another, and he's suggesting an authentic view is integral to the path to liberation. And then what is often used to be called right thought. Well, that again that sounds like brain control or thought police or something like that, but it's not. The term doesn't mean thought so much as it means resolve. Resolve, aspiration. Those trained in Tibetan Buddhism or Mahayana Buddhism, motivation, intent, authentic intent, right? So we have desires, but we don't act on or even intend to act on all of our desires. But so a desire may spin. You may want something, desire something, and then think, maybe not. And then without it ever turning into an intent, it just fizzles away. So I wanted it for a while, but then I didn't after all, right? But if it clicks over into an intent, now the gears are meshing, and now you're in action. There's something in motion there for action to occur. And so is your intention, your resolve, your motivation, are they authentic? Are they in accordance with reality or not? Right? So that's the second one. Authentic resolve. Then we go from there. And those two, authentic view, authentic resolve, those are most strongly correlated with the higher training in wisdom. This is according to one of the sutras itself. Those two are related to wisdom. Right view, that makes sense. But also it takes wisdom to have authentic resolves, authentic motivations, authentic desires. Any fool can desire anything. But you have to have some wisdom to desire things that will truly provide you with the happiness that you seek, that would lead you to liberation rather than to simply the perpetuation of suffering. So the first two have to do with wisdom. And then there's authentic speech in accordance with reality, authentic action, acting in accordance with reality, authentic livelihood, that again is in accordance with reality, and those three correspond to the higher training in ethics. And then we have another triad, and this is authentic effort. How much effort, what kind of effort, in accordance with reality or out of control, out of accord with reality. Authentic mindfulness, right mindfulness, authentic mindfulness. So a lot of you have heard me speak about mindfulness in the past. Mindfulness is a mere mental factor. It's simply a non-forgetting. It really is simple. It's bearing something in mind, retaining something in mind with which one is familiar without forgetting it. Okay, so whenever I've given my basic 1 week long shamatha retreat, that always comes up, right? But it's perfectly clear that if that's all that's operating, then that's not necessarily wholesome, that's not necessarily going to lead you towards liberation. You could be a sniper, and you could say, where are my bullets? How do I take apart this? How do I clean this gun? How do I find my target? Oh, I remember, this is my target. Oh, here, oh yeah, now my gun is well oiled. Now it's ready to shoot. Oh, good, I remember. And that, yep, I'm ready to go. Okay, let's go kill the person. That's mindfulness, but it's not authentic mindfulness, right? It's not in accordance with reality. It's not a type of mindfulness that leads to liberation. So authentic mindfulness always is rooted in ethics, whereas the mere mental factor of mindfulness can be unwholesome, wholesome, or neutral, right? Authentic mindfulness, and then finally authentic samadhi, authentic concentration or mental unification, because the term samadhi means really coming together, a kind of composure, collectedness, right? Or as one translator, a very good Western scholar, Peter Harvey, translates as mental unification, but once again it must be authentic, merely being very concentrated, like a person playing a video game, or playing a fast game of tennis, or air traffic controller. They're very concentrated, but is it the type of concentration or samadhi that liberates? No. And so there is the correspondence. Those three, the effort, the mindfulness, the samadhi, those are the three aspects of the Eightfold Noble Path, the Noble Eightfold Path, that are most directly related to the higher training in samadhi, or mental unification. So we're moving now that we're onto the reality of the path. We can speak not only of the reality of suffering, but also what results from following an authentic path. This path of ethics, the path of samadhi, the path of wisdom. And the Buddha addressed this specifically. He spoke of, and without any kind of denigration or disparagement, he spoke of the kind of happiness, mundane happiness, that comes from having enough to eat, enough food, enough shelter, enough clothing, and medication or medical care when you need it. Those are all hedonic, and I think we all care about them. And the Gautama himself, when he had finished with his austerities, he too made it clear that he valued having good health, because the mind that we're functioning with arises independent upon the body, and if the body is weak, emaciated, malnourished, then we simply cannot function at our best. And he recognized that. That's why he took the food, of course. And so, having pointed out, acknowledged the value of these types of mundane happiness. Again, let's just look at them. Having enough to eat. If you don't have enough to eat, it's hard to think about anything else. I mean, if you're just hungry because you skipped lunch, that's one thing. But if there's no food around, I was watching CNN this morning and saw people from Afghanistan crossing over the border into Iran, just hoping to find work. Coming from one terribly troubled country, entering another terrible country, very troubled country, but where they thought there might be a little bit more economic opportunity. But Iran doesn't want them. So as I just watched these people getting off a truck, happily they gave me some clairvoyance. CNN gave me some clairvoyance. To see these people, you know, it was only probably a day old, getting off these trucks in the middle of the desert, in a foreign country, they probably don't speak the language, and just desperately hoping to be able to get enough work to eat. And just imagining being in that situation. How could you even dream about developing samadhi, cultivating wisdom, and so forth when you're just hungry? And let alone if you have children. That would occupy you much more than the hunger pangs in your own belly. But thinking, my children, and can I get enough work just to have my children have enough to eat? That would be overwhelming for your mind, right? If it's cold, not just chilly it is as now, but it's cold, and you don't have protection from the elements, you have no place to live, you have no shelter, you don't have enough clothing, it's going to be hard to do anything else. It's hard to think about anything else than that. And likewise, to finish this, if you're ill, if you're seriously ill or injured, it's hard to think about anything else. So the Buddha acknowledged the tremendous importance of these, and he said, now, on that basis, then there is the joy that arises from ethics. He called it the joy of blamelessness, of having a clear conscience, right? Of leading an ethical life, and having that satisfaction, that contentment at the end of the day, and at the end of a life, that you know this was a life well led. And it's a much deeper type of satisfaction, a type of sukha, genuine happiness It's coming from what you bring to reality rather than what you're getting from it. So he acknowledged that as being far greater than any kind of happiness you'll get that is stimulus-driven. Because we all know that we don't have enough to eat, don't have enough shelter, clothing, medication, that will occupy our minds. But once we have enough, we're taken care of, we're covered, and our families are covered, and we don't have that immediate anxiety. It's not in the front of our mind. You know, can I take care of my children tomorrow and the next day and so forth and so on? Then that's a great relief, not to have that suffering, that anxiety. But then if you have twice as much as you need, and 10 times as much as you need, and 100 or 1,000 times as much as you need, as the fabulously wealthy have, of course, now it's known scientifically as well as just by people who are not scientists, that it doesn't give you twice, 100 or 1,000 times more happiness. It may not give you much more at all, right? You just have more stuff. And so once you have enough, that's really where the fork in the road comes. Once you have enough, now where will you go? You have enough. You're covered. Now what? More of the same? Or will you have a display of imagination, an arousal of imagination to think, all right, but this was all preparation to find genuine happiness. And so the Buddha spoke then of the genuine happiness, the sukha that arises from ethics, the deeper sense of sukha that arises with no stimulation from outside at all, that comes from samadhi, right? And the Buddha said of the bliss of samadhi, that this is a bliss, a kind of joy not to be feared. Not to be feared, right? There are many other cases where he said, don't get stuck. All of you have had, probably all of you had teachings on shamatha. So you've at least heard about the bliss of shamatha, and many of you have had some taste, some foretaste, a little glimmer at least, of the joy that can arise from simply practicing shamatha. But he said, don't fear this. Don't fear this. Don't get stuck. Don't cling to that as an end in itself. But there it is. It is a joy not to be feared. The joy arising from samadhi, the genuine happiness arising from samadhi. And then finally, the culmination of this, and that is the joy arising from wisdom. And that's something of, one could say, unconditioned value, with no limit, limitless value. And so what type of wisdom is that? What kind of knowledge or insight is there in that? And as you know, I engage with a lot of scientists, so many of whom I respect very greatly, and who have provided us with so much knowledge. Again, I think it's probably true to say that scientifically speaking, we've learned more in the 20th century about the natural world than in all of the centuries that preceded that. I mean, it's just extraordinary, and for many reasons, but just the sheer volume of scientific research going on, the kind of money spent on it, the type of intelligence and creativity and just time spent in scientific inquiry. Well, the 20th century was like none other that preceded it, and the 21st century continues to go, you know, in that same route. And so we can be, I feel, tremendous gratitude and appreciation for the enormous amount of knowledge, and so much of it very, very useful, and some of it just curious. I mean, knowing that there are exoplanets, there are planets around other suns, right now is not very useful. I'm glad to know it. I kind of suspected it was the case, but not very useful at this point. But so much of scientific knowledge, of other kinds of knowledge, is of practical benefit. Holding a microphone, not having to shout at the top of my lungs, you know, just to 30 people. For medicine and so forth and so on, all of that, we can revel in the many aspects of knowledge, the broadening of our knowledge that has come through scientific inquiry, which has been almost entirely focused outwards, even in psychology. Almost entirely focused outwards. Even psychologists tend to focus professionally on other people's minds, right? Investigating them, understanding them through questionnaires, through interrogation, through studying behavior, and studying brain activity. So even the study of the mind, which is so internal, so subjective, scientifically, it's a scientific study if and only if it's done objectively. Where's the data? So evidence-based, like the cultivating emotional balance, that training is now evidence-based. Why? Because scientists got involved. By the way, the scientists weren't receiving the CEP training. They never received it. The ones conducting the research, they never received it. But they were conducting it on those who did receive it, and they found objectively, through questionnaires, brain studies, physiological studies, behavioral studies, oh, this was really an effective training. So it's evidence-based. Why? Because it's physical evidence. It's quantitative. It's objective. All good. All good. But now we ask this deeper question. What types of insight, what types of knowledge not only expand your knowledge repertoire or make your life easier or healthier or more comfortable or give you cooler things to play with, you know, toys and entertainment and all that kind of thing, but what types of knowledge, what types of direct insight actually transform your mind irreversibly? Not only transform, I mean, a lot of things could transform the mind badly. Brain damage could, at least for this lifetime. But in Buddhism, the stakes, in the Buddhist teaching, the stakes are far, far greater. You can damage your brain, but it's only one brain. It's only for this lifetime, right? You may be psychologically impaired, you may have schizophrenia, you may have some other kind of psychosis. But it's just one lifetime. Then it's over. I don't think you can carry your psychoses into the bardo, because then you have a subtle mind. So you may remember being psychotic, carry through. Now you have just a mind-made body. You don't have brain chemistry, you have no neurons. You have no brain to be injured or damaged or diseased. So from a Buddhist perspective, everything that is contained within one lifetime, you can say, well, that's just one page in the book. It's just one chapter. So even if it lasts for the whole chapter, it's just one chapter. Right? In the Buddhist teachings, in the Buddhist view, the stakes are far, far higher. And that is what types of insight, what type of direct knowledge transform irreversibly in a way that matters, that counts from lifetime to lifetime. And most importantly, which types of insight not only transform, but liberate. Really free us from the root causes of delusion that underlie craving and all other mental afflictions, which underlie all the types of suffering that we experience. And there, let's just go through them briefly. It's getting a bit chillier, so I'm going to wrap things up pretty quickly here. The Buddha said of all footprints made by sentient beings, the biggest footprint is made by the elephant. I think it's true, whales don't leave footprints, otherwise he might have said a whale. Right? But no footprints for the whales. So I think they have the biggest feet, at least as they did in India. That was the largest footprint was made by the elephant. And the Buddha said similarly, of all the insights, which one leaves the greatest imprint, has the biggest impact on the human mind? Realization of impermanence. To realize non-self, to realize emptiness, of course that's deeper, but not so accessible, that'll take some work. But to really fathom the reality of impermanence, of one's own, of our own mortality, the fact that everything we're experiencing is in a state of flux, all our relationships are in a state of flux, or to take this fourfold aphorism. Everything that is born dies or perishes or destroyed. Everything that is acquired is lost. Wherever there's meeting, there's parting. And anything that ascends to a high level, like high reputation and so forth, everything that goes up goes down. There's four existential facts, that are so easily ignored and that we might so deliberately wish to cover up, because it takes the fun out. It takes the security out. It takes a lot of the joy out of samsara. As we meet someone and think, now that I've met, now it's certain we will part, and we will part forever. Now that this is born, it will die. Now that I've gotten this, oh yeah, well I'm going to lose it. And it's built in. That's the interesting thing. As just a natural truth, is that for any of those changes to take place, it doesn't have to wait. This is a core truth in the reality of impermanence, is that for something to perish that arose, that was created, it doesn't need to wait for something to damage it, to kill it from outside. It's built in. It's built into the very nature of that which is born internally. It's already on the route to destruction. Wherever there's meeting, it's internal. It's already on its way to dissolution. It's built in. So it's like that genuine unhappiness or genuine happiness. It doesn't need some external stimulus to make that reality of impermanence manifest. Just give it enough time and it will happen all by itself. To fathom that radically shifts our orientation to if everything in life, and radically shifts our orientation to the very pursuit of happiness. And I think we know this. Some of you, like myself, have had a near-death experience. So mine was when I was 23, my third case of hepatitis. Many of you heard about it. But it did make quite an impression on me. That when Dr. Durnan gave me the medication, he changed my diet, and in one day, after several days of dying, and then receiving his medication, and the next day getting better. And then it was really clear, in one day, it was very clear to me that I'm not going to die this time because of hepatitis. I'm now getting better. But in that same breath, it became so clear to me, he didn't save my life. He just postponed my death. That it's just, okay, not today, not tomorrow, not this case of hepatitis, but what I thought I was going to, a couple of days, I thought 50-50 chance that I'll die today or tonight. That was that close. That was my sense of it. I think there was a lot of people who agreed with me at that time. But to have that sense that that day is still coming, it's just not quite yet here. It does change everything. And a lot of people have had serious automobile accidents or whatever. In many cases, not all, but many cases, it radically shifts their priorities. The things that had seemed important previously, now overnight, not so important, right? Because one has now had thrust upon oneself some insight, some really life-changing insight into the reality of impermanence. Well, in meditation, we seek out that realization without having to wait for a near-death experience, right? So there's one, the first of these three marks of existence. The second one we simply call dukkha. And how we unpack that, if we go to classic Buddhism, is that all experiences that are tainted by mental afflictions, craving, hostility, delusion, all experiences of anything that are tainted by mental afflictions, they are dukkha, and I think the best translation I have is unsatisfying. It's not that they're suffering or painful, a lot of them are not painful or suffering, but they're unsatisfying. There's something about them that's built in, and it's not the object's fault. It's not because some problem of the appearances. It's not a fault of the reality of impermanence. It's because of the mental affliction. It's because of the presence, the role, the impact of the mental affliction on our experience, of whatever it may be, that we will not derive satisfaction. It won't last. So that's kind of sobering. If one really gets that, it goes in, the hook it sinks in, and it just catches us. That nothing that I'll ever experience in this or any future lifetime will truly be satisfying, and as long as my mind is still prone to mental afflictions. If you really understand that, not just as I learned that in Buddhism, but if you actually totally get it, then that becomes the top priority. And however long it takes, whether it's 5 years of retreat or 5 lifetimes or 500 lifetimes, it's kind of like that's all that really matters, personally speaking, is I must be free of mental afflictions. Whatever it takes, however many trials, tribulations, sacrifices, what have you, that's it. Because nothing else will ever satisfy. If I live 1,000,000 lifetimes, it'll be 1,000,000 lifetimes of dissatisfaction. So that's big. That really transforms things. And then, of course, now very briefly, the reality of non-self. That nothing that I identify with as I or mine is truly I or mine. And deeper than that, more broadly than that, is the reality of impermanence. Of emptiness, of the lack of inherent nature of all phenomena. So I won't elaborate on this. I would like now to come back historically, to the Buddha giving his fundamental, his groundbreaking discourse of turning the wheel of Dharma to these 5 comrades of his who now became his 5 close disciples. And by the time he finished his discourse, and I just learned this recently when I was studying up again, to get more of the detail, one of the five of his close companions, named Kodanya, by the time the Buddha had finished with his discourse, Kodanya, right there, having heard the words of the Buddha, realized nirvana. Right there. He realized what it was all about. He got the point. Became a stream emperor. He was the one. Now the other ones in due course, they gained realization as well. But one right there, he was so close, he was so ripe. In the Buddhist terms, there was so little dust on his eyes that he could hear one 10 or 15 minute talk, and he achieved nirvana. And so And this was called a direct realization of nirvana by way of insight. And what triggered it for him? What nailed it? What catalyzed that profound breakthrough? And it was his insight into origination and cessation, or we would call it dependent origination, pratitya samuppada, dependent origination. The origins of suffering and the cessation of suffering, because that's what the whole Dharma talk was about. The origins of suffering and the cessation of suffering. And his fathoming that, it's all about causality. His fathoming that gave rise to realization of nirvana. Now those of you who studied Madhyamaka, you know that nirvana is synonymous with shunyata, emptiness. A lot of you have been trained in the teachings by Tsongkhapa, by Nagarjuna, and you'll know that the teachings on dependent origination and the teachings on emptiness are essentially the same teaching. One is coming by way of relative truth, of dependent origination, of causality taking place within time, right? Causality. The other coming in from the perspective of ultimate reality, the absence of inherent nature. But this interface between the two, because all conditioned phenomena do arise in the process of dependent origination, therefore they are empty. And because phenomena are empty, therefore they can enter into causal interrelationships. Those two. That it can seem like if everything had no inherent nature of its own, if nothing existed from its own side, it would seem like, well, then there couldn't be any causality because nothing really there. But in fact, just the opposite is true. It is only because things do not have their own inherent nature that they can, that we can, that anything can engage in these interdependent relationships. If they had their own independent nuclei of an inherent identity, they would all be absolutely independent and nothing could influence anything. So Kodanya realized this. He realized emptiness, he realized nirvana by way of dependent origination, which Nagarjuna calls the king of reasoning. The king of reasoning to realize emptiness is by way of dependent origination, and that was Kodanya's avenue. Now, a point again that I just recently learned is, when does the wheel of Dharma turn? So this was called the Buddha's discourse of turning the wheel of Dharma. When does the wheel of Dharma turn? This is a technical point. I find it so interesting, though. I just learned it recently. And that is, did it turn when the Buddha started to talk about the middle way and the two extremes? No. Did the wheel turn when he was talking about the reality of suffering? Nope. When he'd finished all four, he'd given his whole talk. He'd covered all four of the Noble Truths. Has now the wheel of Dharma turned? No. Still not. The wheel of Dharma turned only when Kodanya realized nirvana. That's when the wheel of Dharma turned. It wasn't enough for him to talk. It wasn't enough for somebody else to hear. Somebody had to hear and understand and gain direct realization. And that's when Kodanya gained realization, that's when the wheel of Dharma first turned. I find that so interesting, that it takes transmission. Otherwise, the wheel of Dharma has not turned. There's just been the preamble, a clearing of the throat, a preparation of the way. But the wheel of Dharma turns when someone else gains realization. And that was the whole point. I find that very, very interesting. We're coming to an end here. So the emphasis here is that the turning of the wheel of Dharma resulted in others, namely Kodanya, gaining direct insight through their own personal experience regarding the reality of the cessation of suffering. That's when the wheel of Dharma turns, through their own direct insight. And the term here is called personally experienced, and you can see in the notes the Pali, which comes from the Satchikaroti, to see with one's own eyes, to experience for oneself, as in the injunction ehi pasuko, and some of you have heard me say that before, ehi pasuko, come and see. Come and see. This wonderfully experiential, pragmatic orientation of the Buddha's teachings altogether. Not come and learn, come and memorize, come and believe, come and follow, come and obey, come and have faith, come and believe. None of the above. It's come and see through your own experience. That is really following the Buddha's path. And so Kodanya did that. And so it simply does highlight the spirit of pragmatism, of empiricism that runs through all of Buddhism, challenging us to question our own assumptions, not just the assumptions of other people, And again, to just follow the notes, and you see we're almost finished. The premise being here is with these teachings on the Four Noble Truths, I'll keep on calling that out of habit, the four realities for Aryas, that if these are indeed real, if the propositions about them are true, then the more deeply we investigate them through our own experience, through direct observation, through reflection, through reasoning, through logic, questioning in every way we can, from any perspective that we can, if these are indeed true, the more carefully we investigate them, the truer they will appear. And if something is false, if a proposition is false, the more carefully we investigate it, the falser it will appear. So I'll end on this note as a concluding remark. Scientifically, because you know I'm interested in science and the interface between science, because science is the dominant knowledge paradigm of modernity, and Buddhism is coming in and saying, hey, there's somebody else on the block. Science is not the only kid on the block. Buddhism is also a knowledge tradition, not just a religion, a belief tradition, a faith tradition. And so in scientifically speaking, something is a scientific truth only when it has been published through a peer review process. It's true. If you've simply made the discovery, but it's not been corroborated by anybody else, it's not been published, it's not gone through the peer review process, well, that's an anecdote. That's your experience, fine, but were you drunk? Were you taking LSD? Were you lying? How do we know? That's just what you say. It's just a statement. But once it passes through peer review by knowledgeable, well-informed, capable, open-minded, objective peers, and it gets into nature, it gets into science, it gets into any top-notch peer-reviewed scientific journal, on the day of its publication, that's when you say, that's when the discovery was made. And so it's a little bit like Kodanya. And that is, it's not a discovery until somebody else has affirmed it as well. Right? It has to be public. So Buddhist teachings became public when Kodanya got it. Right? It was public, because now it's two people. It's two people. And likewise in science, it's not enough for one person to discover it. Somebody else needs to review it, to corroborate it. Best yet, do the research all over again and see if they can get it as well. So there, in this regard, I think the way the Buddhist teachings began, to my mind, if we try to find a category that's within our categories of modernity, the modern West, which is now modernity, of three knowledge traditions, of science, of philosophy, and religion, I don't think anything that I've just summarized here in this short talk, I don't think anything that was religion. Not as we understand it. There was no God, there's no belief system, he didn't say obey him or anybody else. He didn't say rely upon an authority, allegiance, and so forth.
They're getting very worried.
Okay, then we must leave, yes? Okay, then we must. So I think we see here that science is about direct observation, about knowing through your own experience, and that is what the Four Noble Truths, the four realities for Aryas, is all about. It's fundamentally knowing reality as it is and finding those aspects of reality that liberate. And so welcome to Sarnath. Welcome to the place where the Buddha first turned the wheel, and we try to have that wheel continue to turn to this day. Oh, and the sun has gone down.
Are there any more of the handouts?
You must ask Ravi. If there aren't any right now, there certainly can't be. So I think you're welcome.
Hi, I'm Jerry Pearson.
Hi, Jerry.
Hey, how you doing?
I think I should be asked not for whom the whistle blows. It blows for you.
Yes.
I thought it was a very loud whistle.
Wasn't subtle at all.
Very consistent.
Yes, and I'm still wired, I see. Wired in multiple ways, I see. Et voilà.
One. Okay, stage two. Yes. They had 5.